I hate time, make it stop. When did Ursula become classic rock? Is probably a line Glimmer would write in a parody song about how cringe she thinks her father is. But have you ever really thought about the passage of time in the Xenoblade series? I don't mean within every individual game, because I think those just take place within a time bubble. You can pass 365 days on the overworld in Xenoblade 1, and the characters' ages in the Infinity Chart will never go up. But in between the games, because there's a lot of surprising things if you look in between the lines of both the amount of time that has passed in between Xenoblade 1/2 and 3, and how that time skip affects things within the game itself. Without further ado, spoilers for all numbered Xenoblade games and their derivatives, and let's get to it. I already led with it in the thumbnail, so we're going to talk about the relative ages of characters first. Because yes, the characters in Xenoblade 3 and Future Redeemed, who are the next generation of characters from 1 and 2, are actually very frequently older than their parents were during their original adventures. I singled out Nikol and Shulk just because they look very different, but it is in fact true. Both Nikol and Glimmer's term markers in Future Redeemed are the same as Mio's in the base game, indicating that they are in their 10th term, and Glimmer even mentions that she was very close to homecoming when she crashes out over being removed from the Flame Clock system. This means that Nikol is biologically 19 years old during Future Redeemed, which puts him a year older than Shulk and Fiora were during base game Xenoblade 1, and equivalent to Shulk, who was also 19 during Future Connected. It's less surprising because Rex is noted to be young, and Glimmer and Mio are noted to be about as old as you can get as a soldier of Agnes, but yeah, those two are also older than Rex was in Xenoblade 2 when we first play as him. Not sure how to count that relative to their mothers, because Blade age equivalents are always weird, because they don't physically age, but can mature in different ways over time. But then also in the family photo, not only does Nia look like an in-between of Blade Nia in Xenoblade 2 and Queen Nia in Xenoblade 3, but Pyra and Mithra do also look noticeably visibly older, so it seems like Blades can choose to physically age if they want to, at least after the end of Xenoblade 2, though Bridget and Pandoria don't look physically aged, but they also didn't change Zeke and Morag's models at all besides changing their outfits, so they probably just put less effort into those, so we can't really look at that there. It's confusing, and the world state post-Xenoblade 2 is likely contradictory with the world state pre-Xenoblade 2, so let's not give ourselves too big a headache thinking about that, especially because we're talking about Mio and Glimmer here, who have one Blade and one human parent, and we're going to just assume that they age like a human would, because nothing would make sense if they didn't. Also, in a similar camp to this, Panacea at 19 is in fact older than Rhine was in Xenoblade 1, though she is younger than Charla was. And Linka is definitively younger than at least Zeke. She's 18, turns 19 during a side quest, though her age on the community chart doesn't update, and Zeke was 25 during Xenoblade 2. By the way, Rex and Zeke are the only two party members in 2 who have confirmed ages. Zeke's is the only one in-game. As far as I know, Rex being 15 was only ever stated once in a pre-release interview with Tetsuya Takahashi that was for a Japanese outlet and never officially translated. So yeah, it's not only the big lore bombs like the Siren model kit stuff or any of the big developer interview questions from the Xenoblade 1 or 3 art books that gets hurt by it, but even basic information like main characters' ages is sometimes locked behind the Xenoblade series' baffling and infuriating insistence on making as little supplemental material as possible available outside of Japanese, even though the games themselves are in a double-digit number of languages now. It is then, of course, unsurprising that there is no canon age for Xenoblade 2's Vandam, but if you look at the phonics dialogue that also confirms Vandam is a pseudonym and he's actually Orion nobility, it does make reference to his more sprightly days, so I am inclined to believe he's at least within the ballpark of Guernica Vandam 60 years old. Vanguard from Xenoblade 1 doesn't have a canon age, but he clearly doesn't look as old as Guernica, and Jack Vandam from X is 48, so this seems to imply Xenoblade 2 Vandam is the second oldest, if not tied for the oldest, Vanman in the entire Xeno series, including Gears and Saga, as Vanderkam from Xenogears does not have a canon age but doesn't look older than his 40s by that game's art style, and Vanderkam from Xenosaga is confirmed to be 33 years old, which is coincidentally the same age as Monica Vandam in Xenoblade 3. This actually means that even if you ignore Gondor, Matthew, and assuming Niall's maiden name was Vandam, her as well, Xenoblade 3 would still have both the oldest and youngest Van person in the entire series, assuming Xenogears Vanderkaam isn't significantly younger than he looks. It is, of course, also worth pointing out that Matthew is probably a lot closer to Monica in age than you would think, because even though he acts that way, he is still clearly old enough to treat anyone within the age range of a Kevesi or Agnian soldier as a kid, and he has an adult younger sibling, who is also pretty clearly older than any soldier. If you say Niall is like 21 to 23 years old, then Matthew being at least his mid and most likely late 20s still makes the most sense. To be fair, Dylan is Matthew's childhood best friend, and he is 23, so maybe Matthew is closer to that age than we think. Mickey, the character who is funny for having a crush on Niall because he's a disciple of Matthew from like a martial arts standpoint, is 18, so maybe it's more of a 20, 23, 21, 23, something like that. I don't know. I have a feeling Matthew's just a bit older. Him being 25 just makes the most sense to me for whatever reason. I think it's just funnier the older he is, because the idea of a guy in his mid-20s exasperating A more than Ryan ever exasperated Alvis is peak comedy, and if giving Matthew a canon age would deconfirm that, then maybe I am actually okay with them never giving canon ages for the future Dean characters who don't have them. Of course, Gondor being 18 is just outright the youngest fandom in the entire series, but that's something actually on Base 3's affinity chart, so it's not worth as much fanfare. Funnily enough, Monica, as the youngest Van person if her own daughter and ancestor weren't playable, would have still made her borderline elderly by numbered Xenoblade party member standards. The only party members in 1 older than her are Dixon, a disguised member of an absurdly long-lived race, though to be fair, his cover age is 44, Alvis, a computer, Melia, a slow ager who is the High Entia equivalent of a teenager, and Ricky, the single legitimate case. Assuming Morag is in the same age bracket as Zeke and ignoring Blade jankiness, the only Xenoblade 2 party member Monica is younger than is Vandam from that game, so yeah. Now yes, if you stack her up next to Future Redeemed, she is older than her 2 forebears and the 2 soldiers, but this time Shulk and Rex are almost certainly older than her, and Ontos always was. And the crazy thing is, although I guess this does enforce just how messed up even the city is as a society, if, yeah, they're not limited by the term limits, but they still can't grow that old, because despite there being several other citizens on the playable cast, Monica is the second oldest non-immortal party member in Base 3. Gray is the older one, being a rare case seemingly of getting to 60 like Guernica did, and interestingly enough, he is actually the oldest regular aging humanoid party member in the entire Xenoblade series. The oldest playable human in X is 57, and any character that is older has an undefined age, but is from a species that is likely to be extremely long-lived. So yeah, Gray is actually the oldest, and he is in fact also older than 8 out of 9 Xenogears party members, and while the proportion for Saga isn't nearly as good, he is at least older than Cosmos. While we're talking about Xenoblade 3 characters who are older than their parents were in their original games, Riku in base game, he does in fact count for that, even though I'm almost certain he is physically younger than Ricky was in Xenoblade 1. But, like, he did actually live through that 1,000 years. He was conscious and active the entire time. Riku has a much better claim to being 1,000 than Pyra and Mithra ever did for being 500. It's unclear how conscious Melia was when trapped in Origin the entire time, but depending on how long the time skip between Future Connected and the intersection is, and how long she spent active as Queen of Keves in Aionios before getting captured, there is a good chance that she surpassed Callion's age of 151 at some point, and if she was conscious in Origin for the entire 1,000 years, she even blew past her father's 320 years old. To be fair, using Melia here is probably cheating. She was already older than her mother in base game Xenoblade 1, and I don't think most of the other orphan characters can say that, at least in their first appearance in the series, so that's certainly something. And honestly, the wildest case, and this kind of goes directly into yet another discussion on the length of the time skip between Xenoblade 1/2 and 3, is Georgie, the NPC from Yesterdale, who is confirmed to be the granddaughter of Giorgio, the curry stand owner from the original Bionis version of Colony 9. Giorgio was 41 years old in Xenoblade 1, and Georgie's dialogue is ambiguous enough where I can't quite tell if they're trying to imply that Giorgio was already dead outside Aionios before the intersection happened. Shulk and Georgie do have dialogue discussing him that is worded as if they're fondly remembering someone who's passed, but in the context they're in, he is dead, so that doesn't really tell us anything. What does perhaps tell us something, though, is the generation in between, as Georgie is 19 years old in Future Redeemed, and the only child we know Giorgio to have had is Paula, who is 10 in Xenoblade 1. And yes, it is very funny that the daughter of the girl who was obsessed with Rhine ended up becoming one of Shulk's trusted confidants. I'm assuming that was intentional on the part of the developer, so good job. It didn't go unnoticed. Like, Noreen's dad was Shulk's senior at the weapons development lab, so it arguably makes more sense for her kid to be the one who's associated with Shulk later on, but they went for the funny, and I appreciate that a lot. Before we start doing any math, we have to remember that most people do physically age while inside Aionios. The only exceptions are Napon, Mobius, and the Queens. So while people like Shulk, Rex, Panacea, Linka, and Georgie were physically incarnated into Aionios by origin seemingly at random, I guess in a similar way to the Napon, they do still physically age, and anyone who was incarnated like that who died, similar to any Napon who died, was still stored in origin and would still be restored after the end of Aionios. So that's not an issue either, but that also means we don't know how old Georgie was when the intersection first occurred, because we don't know how long she was living in the Aionios Colony 9. Unlike the soldiers, we know as a fact that Georgie incarnated at the same age she was when the intersection occurred, and she is definitely older than the original version of herself, but we don't know by how much. Now yes, Georgie does only talk about her grandfather, so it's entirely possible they're not blood related and she was just an orphan as a result of anything Zanzar the Fogbeasts did that Giorgio took in, but I won't be taking that part into account because this entire line of thought is pointless if Georgie isn't Paula's daughter. This now makes our bare minimum time skip the 1 year to get to Future Connected, and then however long it would take for an 11-year-old to grow up and have a child of their own. Unfortunately, the only parents in the numbered games we really know about how old they were when they had their kids are people born into the city in Aionios, so we don't know at what age it would be typical for someone to start having children in a post-Zanza Xenoblade 1 world. Jumping back to 2 for a second, Nia having 3 visibly different looking ages is one thing, but Rex actually seemingly has 4. They of course both have their appearances in Xenoblade 2 itself and the family photo, and while Nia also does have an older looking appearance as the Queen of Agnes, she doesn't age within Aionios. But we do have confirmation from Aionios Moments that Shulk and Rex do. If they didn't go become administrators of Origin after beating Alpha, they would have only lived out their natural lifespans and aged and died. This means that Shulk and Rex don't just look more aged in main game Future Redeemed than they do in the opening cutscene because they're stressed and scruffier, but they are a few years older. We have no idea how much time passed since they first showed up in Aionios, but it seems like they missed the initial founding of things like Keves and Agnes and the Flame Clock system, and once Shulk and Rex met up with each other, they made a beeline for Origin and tried to fight Alpha, then Future Redeemed takes place a handful of years later. This is important because Future Redeemed opening Rex is clearly older than Family Photo Rex, so that is a much more accurate depiction of how old he was when the intersection took place. This all makes sense because while we don't know when Panacea was born relative to Nikol, we do have it on pretty good authority that original Linka is younger than original Mio and Glimmer, and that's just because she isn't in the family photo at all. Yeah, she could be off with her grandfather or at kindergarten or whatever, but I think it would be extremely weird for the big happy reunion photo of the Xenoblade 2 party to not include all the children that had been born at that point. I do, however, think there's a decent chance that the actual age gap between Linka and Glimmer during Future Redeemed is about the same as the one in the real world. And that's because, if you look back at the family photo, while most of Pandoria is obscured behind Nia and Dromark, the outfit she's wearing appears to be a bit more modest and a bit baggier than her original one, which might mean that she is actually pregnant at this time. So Linka, who turns 19 during Future Redeemed, and Glimmer, who is about to turn 20, having an age gap so that Pandoria would be visibly pregnant when a family photo where Mio and Glimmer as babies was taken, actually lines up surprisingly well. Zeke and Morag don't appear noticeably older in the photo, and yes, that's just because they didn't want to edit too much in an image that's appearing on screen for a couple seconds in one cutscene, but this could also indicate that the period of time before Mio and Glimmer were born was long enough for Rex to visibly age a lot and finish going through puberty and all that, but not long enough for someone who's in their mid-20s to age too much. Because of this, and because the romance is so core to the plot of Xenoblade 2, I don't think Rex waited too long after becoming an adult to start a family, and you could argue that he looks a bit younger than Zeke here, so he might be younger than 25, but I'm not sure for certain. We also need to take into account the ages of Panacea, Linka, and Georgie when they first appeared in Aionios, because Shulk and Rex were already competent fighters capable of taking care of themselves and well into their adulthoods when they appeared in Aionios, but the next generation must also have been old enough to fend for themselves for at least a decent period of time until they encountered civilizations like the City or Liberators. Now, yeah, Georgie could have been around in Aionios for far longer than Shulk and Rex were, but if she first showed up as like a 5-year-old and didn't spawn in near a town that wasn't controlled by Mobius, she would not have made it to 19 in the first place. So I think we could safely say they were at least around 10 when the intersection occurred, because 10 is the age when Mobius considers someone useful enough to be taken out of the cradle and start military training. So that's probably also old enough to fend for yourself on Aionios for at least the amount of time it takes to get picked up by some Napon or a friendly patrol of Liberators or City folk. So if Georgie was 10 at the intersection and her mother was only 20 when she was born, that already gives us a 20-year time skip, which is a fairly reasonable amount. Rex being 35 and Shulk being 38 in the opening of Future Redeemed does track with their appearances. I think that makes reasonable sense. But again, Paola's father was 31 when she was born, and it is heavily implied, especially through Monica, that there were a lot of teen parents and large age gaps in relationships compared to the outside worlds, so I think if we are going to fine-tune this time skip number, it will most likely go up from there. But to narrow in on just how much, we have to talk about 2 more factors. The first is Noah and Mio's relative age outside of Aionios, and the second is that Noah and Mio are older than Noah and Mio. What do I mean by this? Well, we can see the entire Kavesi trio in their original lives in the opening and ending of Xenoblade 3. And in these appearances, they do not use the models they use during the main game. They use their younger models from how they appear in flashbacks in the main game, but of course with regular outfits instead of soldier uniforms. We're going to just zero in on Noah here and ignore anything about the aging rates of Machina and Hyentia, and point out that everyone is in their second term during these flashbacks. This means that the original Noah is approximately 11 years old, and well, the Noah we play as is 18 years old. So yeah, a lot of the soldiers in Aionios, even ones that don't necessarily get close to Homecoming, do end up becoming physically older than their original incarnations in the original worlds were. What does this have to do with Mio though? Well, we never see her with a substantial enough flashback to require using a younger looking model, but because the post-credit scenes of Base 3 and Future Redeemed sync up so that the worlds begin combining in Future Redeemed about the same time Noah starts hearing Mio's flute in the base game, it's pretty reasonable to assume that the worlds recombine very quickly after they separate, which means Noah and Mio will be able to reunite pretty quickly after we see Noah here, and they're obviously going to become a couple again at some point. That means that the Mio outside of Aionios has to be pretty close in age to this about 11-year-old Noah for anything about their future relationship to not be weird, unless they don't meet again at all until they're much, much older, and I don't think that's going to be the case given everything else about the ending of Xenoblade 3. And of course the obvious thing to say here is that Mio is once again a year older. Now, the interesting thing about this is Noah and Mio die together in almost every single incarnation of them we see, which you would think would mean they keep getting reborn from the cradles at the same time and would then be the same age. But the age gap between M Mio and N Noah is also about a year because she does reach her homecoming first, and then if the final Noah and Mio are manifestations of the regret of those incarnations of them, why were they also reincarnated a year apart and not at the same time? It's so curious that it has to be another one of those things that always happen the same way because of some higher form of fate than the passage of fate people like Zanza and Mobius tried to manipulate. And that is just the age gap Noah and Mio have and always will have. So we can put Mio outside Aionios at about 12 years old, and also say that the family photo takes place about a dozen years before the intersection, which tracks both with the aging of Nia between the photo and the Queen of Agnes, and Rex between the photo and the beginning of Future Redeemed. Now, we don't know where the unused young Mio design would have actually appeared in-game, But considering that she's wearing an outfit that does not suggest Agni and Soldier at all, I am of the opinion that this is from a deleted scene depicting the young Mio outside of Aionios either before or after the intersection. And when comparing her to other characters in 3's art style, 12 years old or third termer does make a lot of sense. I'm gonna put a pin in the time skip discussion here for a second for 2 reasons. The first is that while finding Noah's age helps us figure out things related to Rex through Mio and Glimmer, it doesn't tell us anything about Shulk, because it seems like none of the Kavesi characters have a close tie to any Xenoblade 1 party members. And secondly, because this does make a few lines a bit more confusing, but I have a good explanation. The first is Linka and Rex's conversation in Chapter 2, where she mentions that she was able to tell that Glimmer was Rex's kid because she looks like Pyra and Mithra exactly. That much isn't weird. Yes, Linka almost certainly knew Glimmer before Aionios, but as we've established, the oldest Glimmer she would have recognized would be 12 years old. So she wouldn't immediately make the connection that this random Agnian soldier who happens to have the same hair color as Glimmer was actually her. Yeah, she should have been able to recognize the Aegis Core Crystal in Glimmer's name, but that's beside the point. She was able to tell it was Rex's kid because she looks like Pyra and Mithra. 2 people who never were young kids. The youngest physical appearance of them we see is in Xenoblade 2. So a much younger Glimmer wouldn't be recognized as looking like them because there isn't a younger them for her to look like. Now, even if my Pandoria pregnancy theory is not true, Linka is still way older than she was in the original world as well, and from Shulk and Panacea's relationship, it is actually pretty clear that the several years in between the first and final battles with Alpha was actually several years, because the House Reed founder statue says that Shulk raised Panacea as if she were his own child. Now, obviously, with Ryan and Charla out of the picture, Shulk, even without Fiora, would raise their kid as his own, no questions asked. But the fact that it is said he did means that Panacea did grow up under his tutelage, and most likely Linka did the same for Rex. Because, well, in Aionios, by the time you hit your mid to late teens, even if you're not a soldier, you are kind of expected to take care of yourself. So Shulk actually raising Panacea implies that she was younger than that when they first met. Yes, the second city's coming of age ceremony in the main game is when they turn 20, but that almost certainly wasn't established at this point in time. I'm sorry I'm about to say this was my legitimate conclusion. It is reasonable to say then that Panacea and Linka grew up for 6 or 7 years under Shulk and Rex's tutelage before becoming the founders of their houses in their own right after the end of Future Redeemed. This does line up with Linka being either a bit younger or a bit older than Mio and Glimmer, but Panacea is a bit more of a wild card because I don't know whether she'd be older or younger than Nikol in the original world. And that's because, while Charla is 21 in base game Xenoblade 1, Ryan is still 18, just like Shulk and Fiora, and Shulk and Fiora's relationship has progressed significantly further because it already existed prior to the game than Ryan and Charla's did. So I honestly think out of all the couples we know had children, Shulk and Fiora are probably the ones who started the youngest. They pretty clearly don't have a kid around Future Connected time, but if they of all people had kids at 20, so their first child was conceived not long after Future Connected, I think it would make the most sense for them. They are a childhood friend romance who've literally known each other their entire lives. Like, we have a version of Noah and Mio who had a kid as teenagers straight up, and I don't think proper real-world Noah and Mio will have their first kid nearly as young as Shulk and Fiora did, because, well, yes, they're also very likely going to get the childhood friends experience. They're childhood friends who only met at like 10 and 11, and yeah, they're finding each other at a pretty hormonal time and have latent memories from Aionios to help them, but either way, it's still a very different story from everything we hear about Shulk and Fiora as young kids indicated they already kind of had a thing for each other before they were even old enough to know what romance is truly. Basically, I'm saying I think Chris was Shulk and Fiora's first child, who was born not too long after Future Connected, while Nikol was their second kid, who was born about the same time as Panacea, both being born 10 to 13 years before the intersection. That's all well and good, but how do we square that away with a line Shulk has after Nikol and Glimmer beat him and Rex to earn the right to go challenge Alpha? He laughs and says, "I didn't expect I'd ever get to celebrate seeing them grow again like this." But how does that make sense? At the very least, Glimmer, and almost certainly Nikol, are older than they've ever been. Well, that's just the Aionios effect. Children are forced into the system only learning how to fight. They don't get to be children, they don't get to interact with any sort of parental figure, and they don't get to grow beyond physically and in ways that are useful for fueling the war machine. This means that emotionally and sometimes maturity-wise, they are stunted compared to how someone their age should be, because of the things they just were never taught or had brainwashed out of them by Mobius's conditioning. When Shulk says he's seeing his son grow again like this, he's not referring to him growing up in a physical sense, because he's never been this grown in the physical sense in the real world. He's saying emotionally, and as a person. Because think about it. Nikol and Glimmer were raised their entire lives in Aionios to be subservient to their superiors in their colony, and then the consuls, to uphold the will of Mobius at all costs and never think for themselves or be on top of the hierarchy at any point. So, them standing up and challenging Shulk and Rex, who they don't know are their parents but do recognize as veteran warriors who have authority over all the liberators, is their first instance in these lives of theirs of asserting their own independence and saying, "No, I want to do this thing people are telling me I can't or shouldn't do." Their character arcs in Future Redeemed are them growing into their own as people in a way that being in the Flame Clock system did not let them do, but that they most likely had already done in their original lives in the original world. If they were like 10 to 13 before the intersection, then that means that they'd probably just started on their teenage rebellious phase, and had just become old enough to begin to figure out who they really were. This is the kind of growth Shulk is referring to. Nikol and Glimmer are no longer cogs in the machine, they are their own people. They are their own people that Shulk and Rex had already seen them grow into once before, and after years of being in Aionios without any of their family members, are nostalgic seeing something like this happen again. Even if they are older, and are growing into their own in a different way than they originally did. And it's just a sense that the relationships Shulk and Rex have with Nikol and Glimmer are different than they ever would be in the real world, because they're able to kind of approach them on their own level without the extra baggage of being their parents. This is the kind of growing Shulk is referring to. And yes, I am fairly certain, due to the interlink in the final battle of Future Redeemed, everyone involved in that shared their memories, so Nikol and Glimmer did eventually figure out Shulk and Rex were their fathers, which is probably why they were as emotional as they were in the ending, because, yeah, you would be sad if an important mentor figure to you, who you had around for a few weeks, was making the sacrifice Shulk and Rex did, but they are so devastated they had to know that those were their dads. And then this brings us back to the time skip. I think it's very reasonable to say that Shulk and Rex are in their mid-30s to early 40s at the beginning of Future Redeemed, and 5 to 7 years older during the game proper. The wrinkle here is that an exactly 20-year time skip makes Paula 30 at the time of the intersection. And that means that Georgie would be showing up in Aionios at a pretty young age, unless she was born when Paula was even younger than Shulk and Fiora were when they had their first kid. For the reasons stated above, I don't quite buy that. I think the last thing we need to look at is Melia, because she has also visibly aged since Future Connected, but she is from a long-lived, albeit normally aging race, so while she clearly looks younger than beginning of Future Redeemed Shulk, we can still try to estimate the amount of aging she went through. I don't remember the exact number, but the Monado secret file states that in base game Xenoblade 1, Melia is the high Entia equivalent of about a 16-year-old. And using that number as an example, that means she ages 5.5 times slower than a Hams. To be fair, we don't know how linear that slowed aging is, though based on young high Entia NPCs in Xenoblade 1, it does seem to be pretty consistent. And it's possible that Melia, as a half Entia who has very high Hams gene integration on top of that, would also age in a different way, maybe after reaching puberty. But answer truthfully, how old does Melia look? Because I think she looks like someone in her 20s. And if the time skip is only 20 years, and she ages at the same rate her entire life, that would make her the equivalent of 19 point something. So I think the time skip has to be at least a few years older, just to make her the equivalent of 20. I've mentioned this before when I talked about this topic, but the celebration at the beginning of the game that we see everyone around Alchemoth doing is for the Queen's anniversary celebration, implied to be the anniversary of Melia's coronation, so celebrating the amount of years that has passed since the ending cutscene of Future Connected. I've also mentioned people allegedly listening to the background voice dialogue in either the opening cutscene or the post-credit scene, and hearing that someone specifically mentioned something implying it's the 25th anniversary, so 26 years of a full time skip. And while that could never be confirmed, and I've never seen an actual source for it, I've never seen someone even able to isolate any of that audio, because that is a pre-rendered scene, so the audio tracks are pre-composited and you can't like data mine out one specific voice. I still think that makes the most sense. If not exactly 25 years since Future Connected, then 26 or maybe 27, because that's just enough for everything to click. If we want to use a round number for Melia's age, 5.5 times 5 is 27.5 years. So the time skip from Xenoblade 1 to the intersection would have to be 27.5 years approximately, if you think, and I do, that it's reasonable to say Queen Melia looks about 21. This would then be 1 year to time skip to Future Connected, another 6 months to rebuild Alchemoth so she can actually become Empress in the first place, and then that would make a full quarter-century time skip in between then and when we see her talking to Nia a year before the intersection. This then puts pre-Aionios / beginning of Future Redeemed Shulk at about 45 years old and Rex at about 42 years old. I think this makes sense with their appearances. I could then easily see Shulk in his early 50s and Rex in his mid to late 40s in the main game of Future Redeemed. Considering how badass 60-year-old Guernica was, I think this is a reasonable age for them to still be fighting fit, but for Shulk to start feeling like he's losing his edge because of how old he is. This puts Paula in her mid to late 30s by the time of the intersection, which does give her enough time to have Georgie at a reasonable age, and Georgie to still be old enough to fend for herself once she shows up in Aionios. And if Nikol is also 12 outside Aionios, that means he was born when Shulk and Fiora were around 35. Knowing them, that's pretty old for their first child, but makes sense for a second or later one. This also does work with Panacea as well. I do like the theory that Ashira is also Ryan and Charla's daughter, and that she is the older sister who is trained under Dunban, hence her having some of his moves. And the only real concern here is on the Xenoblade 2 side outside of characters' ages, because that would make Rex about 30 in the family photo, and I don't know if he looks that old, considering he definitely looks younger than the 25-year-old Zeke from the base game. Though given how he looked at 15, it would make sense for him to remain baby-faced for a while, even after his body went through a massive growth spurt. The other issue is, that would then make the photo 15 years after Xenoblade 2 based on Mio and Glimmer's ages, which is kind of pushing it for Morag and Zeke, and especially Tora not visibly aging at all. Though to be fair, what little of Tora we can see while building Origin hasn't aged at all either, so that might actually just be consistent. And would also mean that Linka was born when Zeke was into his 40s. Normally I would say this is relatively old for someone having their first child, and then I remembered I am living in the year 2026 AD when only people that age can afford to have children in the first place, and also if anyone needs to wait a really long time to be mature enough to raise a kid, it's going to be Zeke and Pandoria. So I don't know, it works really well on the Xenoblade 1 side and a lot less well on the Xenoblade 2 side. But this is the best I have. And this honestly wasn't even the entire point of the video. I just wanted to explore all the neat intricacies around character ages and all of that stuff. And I think that did take up most of the time, so I'm content with this. I hope you learned something, even if you disagree with the theory part of this. And until next time, this is Luxon, signing off. I hate time, make it stop. When did Ursula become classic rock? Why does the switch to make X look ugly? Just make it stop. and bring back Malos and Saga. Way before Z Alpha, there were false gods and Gnosis, and paying for your insolence, the Directs went away. So I checked Nintendo today to see if they'll let me play another Xeno game. Seriously, where is the next reveal? When is the next Direct? I hate Twitter shadow drops. Just tell me when I can expect the announcement instead of randomly dropping something out of nowhere on just some arbitrary weekday, meaning I can't even tell something's happened for 10 hours because I didn't think to check. And now all of a sudden people are already asking me where the trailer analysis is when I didn't even know the game was revealed. Get rid of shadow drops. Get rid of all the cool insider information and additional details on Nintendo Today that are in daily random drops that are FOMO'd and locked away if you haven't seen them before. And just go back to quarterly directs so we can know when to expect things and actually all find out together at the same time.